going to try to start at 11:10 this morning, since there'll be another service starting in here at 11:15. We've been asked to be sure that we are out by 11. This morning's presentation is a little bit different from what you may have been expecting from me before. First of all, I'd like you to set aside your sense of reality for a moment and imagine that you are sitting in a room in Rome around the year 60 AD. That would have been 10 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and about the time that both Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. Although at that time, Paul was preaching from the jail. We're in a small room with white plastered walls and benches all along the outside, and some people are reclining on cushions that they brought with them because the Romans didn't leave any cushions in this room. It's a jail cell. Toward the tops of the walls, the poles that hold the roof up don't quite mat the tops of the walls don't quite come to the eaves of the roof, and so there's a little bit of light coming in around the top of us. And there's a wooden door that's closed behind us and no windows. So all the light we get is coming from those windows above us. But it's still pretty bright, and you've come to visit me, Paul. What we're going to do this morning, what I'm going to do this morning, is basically read and speak what is essentially a one-act play, a monologue, in which Paul tells you a little bit about his life. And I'm going to begin the way he begins most of his letters. Greetings to the Church of God that is in Naples, and to all the saints who are living around us. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Blessed be God, the author of compassion, encouragement, and most of all, love. May he grant us the understanding of what his sacrifice means for us. Good morning. My name is Paul. Family name is Saul. That's because my family's heritage is from the kings of Israel. We Jews are very fond of boasting about our heritage, and we would trace ourselves all the way back to Abraham, if we could. You probably think you know all there is to know about me already, but I think I have a few things to tell you that might surprise you. I'd like you to know them before you begin to talk about the things that I've written for you. Maybe they'll help. But at least I get to tell the story, my side of the story, before you start blaming me for everything that's wrong in your life. I'm here in prison, really house arrest in Rome. It's really not too bad, although I should be preparing for my trip to Spain. I'm not chained. I can move around this room pretty much as I wish. There are a few small openings, and so it's a little bright in here. My friends can visit a few at a time during the day, provided they're willing to undergo the indignity of a Roman strip search. Those Romans and Greeks have always been into promiscuous nudity, and they really enjoy embarrassing my Semitic friends, particularly because we are very modest, we Jews. Someone has asked me to tell you about my life and how I ended up at this place at the age of 66, when I should be relaxing among my peers in the synagogue, arguing over the details of Scripture. or maybe, if I'm lucky, preaching in Spain. So here goes. I was born in Giscala, in the valley of the Galil, what you would call Galilee today, near the sea. When I was a young boy, we moved to Tarsus. Tarsus was a free Roman city of nearly 1 million people in the Roman colony of Asia Minor, what you'd call Turkey today. It was one of the great trading centers of the empire, a place of learning and philosophy, and home to the finest gymnasium in the empire. My father and mother had been raised in Giscala. He was a rabbi and very proud to be of the tribe of Benjamin. But being a Galilean, he was always suspect. The Judeans used to say, nothing good ever came from Galilee. I guess that applies to me as well. They say we're all troublemakers, fiercely independent, free thinkers, and proud. That probably does describe me. Shortly after I was born, a group of rebel Jews staged yet another one of their nearly annual revolts against Roman rule. And of course, one of the Herods, and there were many of them, was in charge. It seems that all of the Herods were pretty ruthless, or at least so my Jewish family and friends thought. He put down the revolt, he executed many, destroyed the villages of Galilee, and sent the more educated people into exile. So we really didn't move. We were deported. My parents and my older sister and I were sold as slaves to a wealthy Greek merchant, mainly because my father spoke very good Greek. Slavery at that time was a 7-year sentence, especially for talented, educated people, based on good behavior. And of course, we were very, very good. After the period of indenture ended, my father was hired as a tutor to the merchant's children. Things didn't change much, although by that time, we were Roman citizens. I was included in the classes from the time I was 3. And when I was 6, I went to the local Greek gymnasium for education with the merchant's children. Father stayed on as a tutor and a monitor for the family's boys. Of course, the girls didn't go to school. That meant that we never lived in that terrible Jewish ghetto in Tarsus. But we tried, nevertheless, to be good Jews. All the students lived at the gymnasium for 5 days each week, and I absolutely hated it. Particularly after a few years when we had the full-day curriculum. I was different. Darker in hair and skin, shorter, poor, circumcised. Let me explain that last comment. The curriculum was the standard of the day: reading and writing Greek, some merchant math, a little geometry, later debate that they called rhetoric, Greek philosophy, and what passed for history, mostly a collection of ancient myths about the divine origins of Rome and its leaders. I was a star student, considered one of the best in the empire. But half of the day, the afternoon, was devoted to athletics. Calisthenics, running, wrestling, and playing at combat. I was short and not very well coordinated, and I was a terrible athlete. I still am a weakling. Just ask the sailors with whom I sailed or the friends with whom I had to work later in my life. But my greatest embarrassment, which I think may have scarred me for life, is that most of the afternoon's physical activities were in the nude. And my circumcision became the taunt of my classmates. I was different and miserable. Maybe you know the feeling. Being an adolescent and different, one of the worst things you can imagine. But my being different probably saved me from an even worse fate, as many of the other boys were taken by the tutors and school benefactors as part-time personal servants. You can probably guess what that means. The school was a brothel for patrician merchants who liked little boys. Then at 13, I caught the fever. You'd call it malaria today. It was very, very prevalent in Tarsus. This was during a summer break. I nearly died, and I never returned to the gymnasium. My father took over my education. Throughout my life, I've had repeated relapses, often at the most inconvenient times when I was traveling or at other times when I was teaching. I pray for acceptance of this affliction, a small reflection of the suffering of Jesus on the cross. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At about this time, my sister was betrothed to a Jewish merchant in Jerusalem, a former business associate of the family. They married. She moved to live with his family, as was the Jewish custom. I was then the only child at home and doted on by both father and mother. I didn't know it at the time, but they were already looking for a suitable mate for me. Mother wanted a servant and grandchildren. I met almost every day with the Jewish men who spent hours studying the Torah, really just memorizing it, together with the books of the prophets and the histories of our people. Father was insistent that I not lose my Jewish roots. He'd been a Pharisee, a very devout Jew, when we were in Galilee, and tried to keep up parts of that tradition in Tarsus. He was certainly going to try to make me one too. At 15, my father decided the family was never going to return to Israel, and that we would remain indefinitely in Tarsus. So, traveling to Jerusalem, even for a pilgrimage feast, was going to be nearly impossible. But he wanted me to be a good Jew. So he sent me to live briefly with my sister. Then I was interviewed, and finally I was apprenticed to a famous rabbi named Gamaliel, who typically taught the Torah and Hebrew ideas to a cohort of about 6 young men. Gamaliel was a legend among rabbis. He was learned and wise, and he was willing to teach. We lived with him, doing minimal chores, but there were women to do most of them, and we learned. I loved that time in Jerusalem. It was perhaps the best time of my life. Even though Jerusalem itself was seething, there were assassinations, resulting penalties against the people, rebellious partisanship, and many of the wealthier Jews in town were actively collaborating with the Romans to enhance their own positions. Soon, I gravitated to a group of Gamaliel's graduates, all Pharisees. Most were bachelors. We lived and ate together, went to the ritual baths and the temple together, and spoke of the Torah together. We really thought we were the best Jews. Paragon examples for all Jews. Father kept talking about a mate, but I resisted. And many good Pharisees were celibate at the time. I never did marry. Do you see a pattern here? I was always the best, the most ardent at what I did. I was a great student of Greek, a star pupil, one of Gamaliel's star Hebrew pupils, independent and okay, all by myself. And now, an almost fanatical Pharisee. I never did anything by half. I was quick to criticize the failings of others, and of course that really made me very popular. And except for my mother and sister, I never really met or got to know any women. As a Jew, I was naturally patriarchal. Women were lesser mortals, even occasions of sin. They were put on earth to tempt men into sinfulness. Boy, did I have a rude awakening coming. There was a Galilean in Jerusalem at that time who suggested that he was the Messiah and the Son of God. He was from Nazareth, although some of his followers claimed he was from Bethlehem, probably because Nazareth is in Galilee and they didn't want him to have that tag. He was a very successful faith healer. He had associated for a few years with the strange Essene Jewish sect outside of Jerusalem and adopted many of their otherworldly ideas. He was a good preacher, perhaps even a prophet. He had many followers. However, if he were the Messiah, he would liberate the Jews from Roman oppression. This was something the Romans couldn't handle. And many Jews didn't want that turmoil either. So we tried him for blasphemy and we crucified him. Unfortunately, this didn't stop his followers, who even began to preach that he had risen body and soul from the tomb and gone into heaven. I didn't accept those ideas because they threatened the very existence of my beloved Israel. Commitment to Yahweh, without exception, was the foundation of the covenant with the chosen people. Gamaliel had taught us this. Then he said, Gamaliel, leave the followers alone. They are Jews and devout. If their path is true, Yahweh will bring all of us to that path. If it's not, they'll die, and so will their ideas. It's not up to us, but up to the will of Yahweh. Obviously, I didn't listen. I was young, and of course, certain of my Pharisaic way of Judaism as the only way of Judaism, as only young men can be. I was impatient with the followers and wanted to crush their sect and their ideas. Keep the Torah. Nothing else matters in life. I feared for the welfare of the Jews if partisanship continued unabated. So I went to the secretary of the high priest. Incidentally, we had a new high priest every year at that time, whoever paid the most for the job. I presented my qualifications and I was deputized to search out and expose followers of the way, as they were called at that time. I was paid a bounty for each man that I exposed. A few years later, when I was avidly pursuing my charge, I was asked to travel to some communities on the road leading north out of Jerusalem toward Damascus, to assess the strength of the followers of the way in Galilee. And then my life changed. I was riding on a donkey with only one companion late in the day. We were about to camp and were searching for a suitable site. A violent rain came up and soaked us. We heard thunder and lightning. The donkey reared up, threw me off, and I fell to the ground, hitting my head on a large boulder near the path. I slept, or maybe I passed out, and when I awoke the next morning, I was blind. After I regained consciousness, my companion made me comfortable and then sought help in a nearby village. The villagers were hospitable, and they took us in. For a long time, it turned out, as my blindness persisted. At first, I was careful not to tell them who I was or to describe my mission, as I didn't know who they were. And then I discovered they were followers. Along with food and shelter, they regaled me with the stories of the Nazarene, most of which I doubted. Then, late one night, when I thought my life was ending, and the malarial fever gripped me once again, I fell into a deep sleep. I was delirious. Dreams, no, visions, overtook me. I saw a heavenly being, a young man, probably a Jew, in general appearance, but glowing with a surreal inward light. Robed in white, he began to speak to me, and I remember every word. What they are saying about me is true. Stop persecuting them, for you are persecuting your God. Learn about me, and then go and preach that story to all people, even to the ends of the earth. I was dumbfounded. I was frightened. But with all my being, I knew that my life had changed forever. I had seen my God. And yes, seen, for my sight had been restored. God had charged me with a task. I spent some time getting well, almost 2 years wandering in the wilderness to the east of Israel, often stopping for weeks among camps of followers who were escaping from Jerusalem's turmoil. I had more visions and learned from them and from the followers many things about the life of the Nazarene. I learned that many of the companions of Jesus were still in Jerusalem and decided I had to go there where all of this had begun. And so, believing that I had been divinely commissioned, that I was a messenger of God, I walked to Jerusalem. I sought out the community of followers in Jerusalem, and when I found them, they were living mostly together. And 3 Jewish men seemed to have become their leaders. Simon Peter, a married Galilean fisherman. John, a confirmed bachelor and philosopher who had taken on responsibility for Mary, the mother of Jesus. And James, the older stepbrother of Jesus, but not Mary's son. I stayed with them and met with them for a few weeks. mostly talking with Peter and checking the stories I had heard about Jesus. Finally, Peter suggested that my command of Greek would make me useful in Antioch on the Orontes, in Syria. He probably just wanted to get rid of me. I was a nuisance. I asked way too many questions, and I kept asking for more and more and more. So I left and I journeyed to Antioch, where a large group of followers had formed among an even larger diaspora Jewish community. I arrived in Antioch in late fall when things were settling down for the winter. I presented myself to the elders, but I think I must have come on pretty strong. I tend to do that. They debated my qualifications and my intentions for weeks. They were certain I was a spy, perhaps a faker. They challenged my vision and my knowledge about the life and teachings of Jesus. And they were really suspicious of my zeal. More than one said that I was too good to be true, all while I impatiently sat in the synagogue and talked with other scholars about matters of little importance. Finally, their judgment was in. I would leave in the spring with an elder of their community, Barnabas, as his assistant on a missionary trip. We then spent weeks drilling our story so that we spoke with one voice. The trip was successful. We established several new communities of followers and taught them the basic ideas of the Messiah. Our technique was pretty consistent. We would find a Jewish community, which usually consisted of elders, devout Jews, mostly men, and others, including women occasionally, who were attracted to many of the ideas of Judaism, but not yet ready to make the full commitment. I was attracted to these lukewarm, almost Jews, and they made easier converts. We called them God-fearers at the time. I began to realize that a harsh message about rules and laws, retribution and punishment, fell on deaf ears. The rules and laws of Judaism were complex. Rather, I preached the love of Jesus, the ability of each of us to change our lives, that material success was a sign of God's blessing. And so I attracted a lot of younger, more entrepreneurial folks as well. My intelligence and lifestyle attracted others. I was in danger of becoming the message myself, rather than conveying the message of Jesus. But I didn't realize it at the time. Humility was not a virtue I practiced or sought. But I began to see that the message was really very simple. Jesus had lived among us and had taught love. All we had to do was follow him, say yes, and love. Later, I repeated this message over and over again in letters to the churches I helped to found. To the church in Corinth, I wrote, "If I speak in angelic tongues but do not have love, I am a resounding gong. If I don't have love, I am nothing. Love never fails, and the greatest of the virtues is love." Jesus was all about love and the demands that love makes upon us. We returned with the winds to Antioch and reported on our successes. But some of the members of the community still suspected my motives, and perhaps my style of mission as well, particularly my willingness to preach to the uncircumcised Gentiles. I was beginning to recognize that Jesus had redeemed all peoples, not just the chosen. As to the chosen, this was a bitter pill. Barnabas would be my keeper for some time. And so we developed a pattern. Leave each spring from Antioch, evangelize in various compass directions, establish communities of followers, appoint local leaders, and return in the autumn to winter over in Antioch. My own ideas began to develop, of course, and I wasn't shy about discussing them or maybe preaching them. Conversion to Judaism was relatively easy at the time. Study the Torah with a rabbi, make an internal profession of commitment, be circumcised, and then keep the rules of the Torah. The followers in Antioch were almost all Jews, and they expected that those who became followers would become Jews first. I had the audacity to question this. There was a practical reason. Circumcision was painful and dangerous, and an impediment to the commitment of many. And the Torah rules on diet and ritual washing were difficult in diaspora communities, where most were not Jews. I suggested that if we dropped these impediments, we would make many, many more converts. My idea was rejected. I insisted, of course. And so I suggested that we needed to go to Jerusalem to get a ruling. I wasn't trusted, and so they sent Barnabas, of course, with me to go to Jerusalem. We set out for Jerusalem yet again, by sea and land. You probably heard that I'm not pretty good at sea. I tend to get ill easily, and I've actually been shipwrecked 3 times during my life. I dare not get on a ship again, or the sailors will throw me overboard because I'm a bad omen. We arrived in Jerusalem, finally. Peter, John, and James were still the apparent leaders, although there had developed a community meeting form of governance. So after I convinced Peter and John, but probably not James, they called a meeting. We went through everything again, and I was vindicated. One didn't need to be a Jew to be a Christian. My friends in Antioch had already begun to call themselves Christian at this time. Peter spoke up for me, reminding his friends that he, of all the apostles, was the first to baptize people into the community who were infirm, something that would have been impossible for a Jew. Little did I suspect that James and some of his friends didn't agree and later would cause me quite a bit of problem. We traveled back. I was triumphant, perhaps a little too triumphant in the Antioch community. I've never been one to keep quiet about my ideas and my successes and my superiority. Ultimately, the elders of Antioch decided that they would no longer sponsor my missions. I was crushed and destitute. But I had enough ego to believe that I was doing what was right, what God had asked, and I could do it without their support. And so I began to set out alone, or with a friend or two. Traveling on Roman roads at that time was very dangerous, but I wore the mantle of God's protection. I was doing God's work. Over the next years, I completed many missions. Typically, I didn't return to Antioch. I created communities of believers throughout Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece. Several of those communities became my benefactors, particularly the people of Ephesus, where I wintered many years, and Corinth, a pair of cities I learned to love and called my own. And I began to develop friend helpers. Timothy, almost like a son to me, Titus, Sosthenes, and a runaway slave, Philemon. And much to my surprise, women. Several widows who had become merchants after the death of their merchant husbands adopted me. I lived in their homes and taught from their homes. Their homes became the center of my ministry in their community. In the Gentile world, that was okay. But to a Jew, this was scandalous. In those homes, I preached the story, and we began to celebrate the Lord's Eucharist. Throughout all this time, my ideas continued to develop. I would have to say that my theology was very practical. While staying constant to the story of Jesus by emulating his life, living his teachings, particularly about the law of love, and suffering with him as he suffered on the cross, I adapted the rest to the needs of my communities. And yes, they were my communities. Each community presented a new challenge. How does the law of love live in the circumstances in which this community finds itself? How far can we bend? What is core belief? My Greek education helped. I started writing letters to the communities I had founded, answering their questions, but using those questions to develop a theology, a creed, and a moral code. It was a messy way to do so, but I didn't have the time of my Greek friends to sit and compose a tome of philosophical thinking. So some of my ideas were inconsistent. Some were community-specific or condition-specific. Some later turned out to be just wrong. I was learning as I was going along. This didn't always make me friends in the growing movement, in the Christian movement in the empire. There were some who continued to insist on the foundational Judaism of their ancestors. Others began to corrupt the notion of spirit to permit licentiousness and free love, and refused to work, expecting the second coming momentarily. This became particularly true among the churches in Galatia, some of which I founded, others of which had been founded by other Antioch missionaries. I had a wonderful, long life of travel and evangelism. I made many friends and some enemies. I was shipwrecked 3 times, often ill. The malaria relapses increased as I grew older. I was imprisoned for inciting erection, freed, and finally, it seems my life seems to be coming to a conclusion. A few years ago, I wanted the approval from Jerusalem, or maybe just to convince them that I was right. I traveled there, taking with them a large donation which had been collected by my church in Corinth. But I was naive. My reputation preceded me, and the conservatives had taken over the Jerusalem community. They called my donation a bribe. Fights broke out, and I was arrested. That's what ultimately brought me here. As a Roman citizen, I insisted that I be able to plead my case as a Roman citizen in Rome. I sit here now in Rome, where there's a large Jewish community and a large Christian community, and they are no longer living together. I know I'll be vindicated. I didn't cause any insurrection. I'd like to think I can convince the Roman community to sponsor a missionary trip to Spain. And I've written my longest letter ever to them, summarizing most of my ideas for this purpose. You can read the letters for yourself, but my thoughts at this time are centered on my absolute conviction that we show our Christianity with love, with acceptance of the inevitable suffering we will endure. For Christ himself showed us this, and that we are all God's children, adopted through the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. If only we say yes and accept the gift of our conversion. We can do this individually, but we also do it in community. For it is in community that we learn from each other, and we are presented with the practical ways to love. I think I'm right about this, but only the ages will vindicate or condemn me. Thank you for listening, and wish me Godspeed to Spain. Thank you. I'm prepared to, we really don't have time for questions. I will take questions next week. I have prepared another version of this monologue, which is footnoted, because probably a dozen or so of the things that I told you this morning are highly debated among biblical theologians as to whether or not they actually happened quite that way. And I've tried to indicate in the footnotes in the version that I'm going to give you afterwards where those questions are and what the current state of the debate is among the biblical theologians. And I'll take other questions next week, so thank you. Copies are up here.